Hey everyone, so let's talk about the flyweight pattern. Now, the flyweight pattern is used to save memory by sharing objects. And it does that by applying two different patterns. One of them I have already talked about here, so you can check that out, but it's the factory pattern, and the other one is the memoization pattern. The factory pattern is, simply put, used to delegate the creation of objects. Now imagine a true factory like this one, right? So we have a factory here and everything runs fine. Imagine that this is actually a stick figure factory, right? So we have a stick figure here. The idea of a stick figure factory is that you can delegate the creation of stick figures, right? That way you don't have to put together all the sticky parts to create the stick figure. You already have that created for you, right? So let's say that you are also a stick figure here, but you can go into the factory, or you can ask the factory. Let me use that arrow here. So you can actually ask the factory to create a stick figure for you, right? And they will deliver a stick figure just as you want it, right? So you delegated that for them. Talking about objects, they basically returned a new, right? The new keyword, new stick figure for you. They already did all that work, right? So with that out of the way, let's talk about memoization. So the idea of a memoization, and I have a RAM figure here just to be more like to talk more figuratively here, but the idea of a memoization is mostly used in calculations, but basically given some args, it will save the args internally and return you what you need without recreating. So it's used to share objects. Simply put, it will make more sense when I show the actual code here, but the idea of the flyweight pattern is actually mixing a factory, right? So you delegate the creation of an object, and inside of the factory we memoize the data, so you don't have to recreate the objects every time. As I said, it will make more sense in a bit, but now for the example that I have today, imagine that you have an application where you can calculate stuff. So you can input, for example, 2 plus 2 and it will return to you 4. You can input 10 plus 5 and it will return to you 15. That's it. Pretty straightforward. And you see that we can use that pattern in other places, but basically imagine that we will have a calculation object, right? Let's say that it's an entity. It receives the calculation, for example, 2 plus 2, saves that internally and returns that to the result to you, right? So we'll have a calculation. We'll have a calculation factory, which is actually the flyweight, right? This will be the flyweight because we'll memorize the results of the calculations. And then you have you here, the stick figure again, and you can input calculations. For example, give me 2 plus 2, and the calculation will actually returns that to you, right? It will return 4, and the calculation factory will actually save this entity here and return that to you without having to redo the calculation every time. Now let me open my VS Code here. Okay, so I have my VS Code open here. I have the console here, so all the logs will be below the code. But anyway, let's implement the calculation thing that I mentioned. So we'll have a calculation entity, right? So calculation, and the calculation will actually receive on the constructor the value that you want to calculate. So calculation, and let's set that internally. Calculation equals calculation. So we'll have that set up, and also let's do this dot result equals, and I'll do something that you should try to never do, but given the example it will make more sense. Instead of delegating that to another thing, but I will use eval. So basically eval will actually run JavaScript code, the string that you supply to it, it will just run. It's not safe or anything like that, so that's why you wanna avoid using that in production apps and things like that. There are special cases where you can apply it, but right now just stick with me because I just wanna make the example simpler. But basically I will supply the calculation to eval basically, and I'll have the result here. So other than that, let me create the flyweight itself. So class calculation factory, as I said, we are using a factory, so we need to return a new calculation here, receiving the calculation that the user wanna do. So we have our constructor. Inside of the constructor, now we want to memorize it. Remember that we want to memorize it. So what that means is that we want to hold the calculations that we did before in memory, so we don't have to redo the eval every time. So we want to have something, if you are from maybe OOP, we want to have something similar to a dictionary here. So I'll create an object where we can hold key value pairs, basically. So this dot calculations equals an empty object, just so we can have somewhere to store the calculations, right? So let's create also a function called do calculation. And inside of this function, here is the memorization and the key part of this video. Basically, what we do is check if the calculation that the user wants to do is actually already saved. So let's do if this dot calculation. If the calculation already exists, or actually doesn't exist, we'll calculate it. So new calculation will supply the calculation, right? And we save that inside of this dot calculation. So basically this dot calculation equals new calculation. So we'll keep that saved, and we return this dot calculation again, which we are basically keeping a dictionary here. So as you can see, the calculation, which is a string, this is a string, right, will be the key of the dictionary that we created. So yeah, that's if you are unfamiliar with JavaScript and is here from an OOP perspective, this may seem a little bit weird. And it is. But basically we are dynamically creating an object and setting the key of the object as the string, which is the calculation that the user actually wants. So that's pretty much all that we need right now. And we can now actually access the calculation factory. So let's call it const calculate. New calculation factory. And now what we can do is, for example, console log calculate. Let's supply 2 plus 2, right? And let's print it out. Calculate dot do calculation. So we have the calculation done. Now notice something. If I console log again the same value, we will see that we will receive the same result, right? But if I console log something indicating that I'm actually creating the calculation object, you will see that it only creates the first time that I call the function, right? So I can call it however many times I want. So for example, I can call it tens of thousands of times, and you will see that it only calls that one time. But see, if I change the calculation to be something like, I don't know, 80 plus 1,000, you see that it calls again when it calls the creation of the object again when I supply the 80 plus 1000, which I didn't had calculated before. So you can see that we are actually only using two objects here, right? At the end here, I may have do calculation 1000 times, but we only have two objects here. We have two calculations, so we have two calculation objects, right? And that is the idea of the flyweight pattern. We basically use a factory, which as I said, returns to you the new calculation, right? It's a factory. But we also mix that with the memoization pattern. The memoization pattern, which basically tells us to save the calculation on this dictionary here, or this object that contains all the calculations. So that's pretty much it. That's how the flyweight pattern works. There is no secret. That's basically it, right? And you can use that for a lot of different things. Here I have just used eval, and basically I have just evaluated the calculation, and that's it, right? That's it. But for example, imagine a scenario where you have let's say that you are working on something similar to GPT and you have prompts, right? You could save the prompts, because whenever you call the GPT API, you have to pay like, I don't know, like 10 cents for each prompt that you send to them. So you can actually keep that saved internally instead of directly calling their API every time. So that's it. Have a good one, and I hope that makes sense.